Did you know that the Brussels EU operates outside of the basic principles of democracy and was designed as a dictatorship under the control of an oil and drug cartel? Did you realise that through not opposing the Lisbon Treaty, national parliaments in the EU have handed over most of their rights for self-determination? This was brought about by the Lisbon Treaty. This treaty, or Enabling Act, was signed in December 2007, and it became law throughout all then 27 member countries in December 2009. It's divided into two parts: the Treaty on European Union and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. The treaty established the laws of the EU into primacy over national laws. The Lisbon Treaty impacted on the rights of over 500 million people to self-determination and national sovereignty. Did you know that 99% of European voters were denied the right to vote on the Lisbon Treaty? The only country where voters were allowed to vote on this enabling treaty was Ireland, whose population constitutes less than 1% of the population of the EU. In June 2008, the people of Ireland rejected the treaty by voting no, but the EU ignored this vote and forced the Irish government into holding a second referendum and coerced a yes vote with a vast amount of money channeled to Dublin from the power brokers behind the oil and pharmaceutical cartel. The other 99% were denied the right to vote on the treaty. The Lisbon Treaty gives the EU extensive legal rights in all 28 member states. Article 335 of the Treaty on European Union demands the following, quote, "In each of the member states, the Union shall enjoy the most extensive legal capacity accorded to legal persons under their laws. It may, in particular, acquire or dispose of movable and immovable property, and may be a party to legal proceedings. To this end, the European Union shall be represented by the Commission." In other words, all 28 member states must now accord the EU the same legal rights that they grant to their own citizens. The Lisbon Treaty is self-amending. Article 48 of the Treaty on European Union makes clear that the legislation is self-amending in future. It may be altered without the EU having to hold an intergovernmental conference or consult citizens via referendums. This article is further backed up by Article 352 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union. This allows the EU to attain its objectives even in situations when, quote, "the treaties have not provided the necessary powers." The Lisbon Treaty enables the majority of EU legislation to be adopted on the basis of proposals from the 28 unelected members of the EU Commission. Article 17.2 of the Treaty on European Union mandates that the majority of EU legislation can only be adopted on the basis of proposals from the EU Commission. Quote, "Union legislative acts may only be adopted on the basis of a Commission proposal, except where the treaties provide otherwise. The Commission, which is the executive body of the EU, consists of 28 members. Rather than being elected by the EU voters, however, this selection is influenced by corporate interests, and the people of the EU are totally excluded from the selection process and are unable to vote commissioners either into or out of office." The EU claims that the Lisbon Treaty facilitates, quote, "increased democratic control from national parliaments." Article 7 of the Protocol on the application of the principles of subsidiary and proportionality attached to the treaty only gives national parliaments the power to complain about things they disagree with. Should even the majority of national parliaments raise a complaint, the EU Commission is still under no obligation to change or cancel any of its actions. Instead, it can simply override the complaint and refer it to be resolved by the bureaucracies of the European Council and Parliament. The Lisbon Treaty prevents the elected members of the European Parliament from having any right to independent lawmaking. Article 289.1 of the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union states that, quote, "The ordinary legislative procedure shall consist in the joint adoption by the European Parliament and the Council of a regulation, directive or decision on a proposal from the Commission." So the EU Parliament has no right to fully independent lawmaking. Unlike in a true democracy, it's unable to freely initiate and enact legislation in all areas of its choosing and of its own accord. The Lisbon Treaty conferred new powers on EU diplomats, who now speak for all 28 member states on the international stage. Article 27 of the Treaty on European Union mandated the creation of a so-called European External Action Service with the aim to, quote, "express the Union's position on international organisations and at international conferences." As a result of this sweeping power grab, EU delegations in foreign countries now speak for all 28 member states with regard to the bloc's policies, including on foreign policy and military policy. So the EU ambassador to Washington has openly claimed that he now speaks for the EU in America. The Lisbon Treaty essentially places the EU above the law. The protocol on the privileges and immunities of the European Union attached to the Lisbon Treaty places the EU above the law. EU buildings and premises are exempt from search. Members of the European Commission are, quote, "immune from legal proceedings in respect of acts performed by them in their official capacity, including their words spoken or written." Moreover, they continue to enjoy this immunity after they have ceased to hold office. The Lisbon Treaty creates a European army under the control of Brussels. Article 42.1 of the Treaty on European Union. Quote, "The common security and defence policy shall be an integral part of the common foreign and security policy. It shall provide the Union with an operational capacity drawing on civilian and military assets." Article 42.3 of the Treaty on European Union. Quote, "Member states shall make a civilian and military capabilities available to the Union for implementation of the common security and defence policy." The treaty sets highly specific rules to apply in the event that any country should decide it wants to leave the EU. Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union requires that countries wishing to leave must, quote, "negotiate with the EU and draw up an agreement with it. For an agreement to be concluded, it must be supported a qualified majority of the European Union Council and obtain the, quote, "consent of the European Parliament." Also, Article 50 assumes that even after leaving, such countries will continue to have a relationship with the EU. Article 53 of the Treaty on European Union states that, quote, "concluded for an unlimited period." In view of the overwhelmingly dictatorial nature of this treaty, one could be perhaps forgiven for thinking that this phrase echoes that of the intended 1,000-year Reich. The Lisbon Treaty has a historic parallel with the German Enabling Act of 1933. The parallels between the Lisbon Treaty and the Enabling Act of 1933 is the takeover of German government by the same interest groups 3/4 of a century ago. The battle for democracy in Europe has lasted centuries. By signing the Lisbon Treaty, we must ask if it has all been in vain. Is it the destiny of 500 million people living in Europe today and countless more as yet unborn to out their lives under a totalitarian dictatorship? I doubt very much that anyone genuinely professing to believe in democracy would argue in favour of this. Nevertheless, as I've shown you, this is exactly where the EU is heading.